The best podcast, The Idlecast.
With the change of mood in American Christianity, British Christianity in the late 19th, early 20th century, from the prevailing postmillennial optimism to an ever-growing premillennial pessimism about what's actually going on in contemporary history, that led people back to Revelation and to the themes of judgment there, and the themes that perhaps this is describing what's going to happen at the end of history, and therefore to prepare us for that. Well, I think what John is doing is getting Christians to think about how they live in a time of suffering and how that time of suffering will eventually be brought to an end by Christ's return and judgment on the wicked.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or its advertisers.
Listener discretion is advised.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to hear is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. And now, Scott Clark.
I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. I can tell you I don't have money. But what I do have are a very particular set of skills.
What are you over here, John Calvin?
It's the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
No, it's not. It's the Idlecast, the podcast devoted to recovering Reformed theology, piety, and practice.
We talking about practice. Not a game, not a game, not a game. We talking about practice.
I'm a pastor and a church historian. This episode is for the week beginning Sunday, June 2nd, 2024, and it's brought to you by the Heidelberg Reformation Association. We exist to recover the Reformed confession and to help others discover it. We're at heidelbergreformationassociation.org. Email or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net.
Don't leave your name and message. I'll get back to you.
Call or text the Heidel phone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563. Don't forget to subscribe in Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app. Give us a 5-star rating in your pod app so that others can find the Heidelcast.
Guess what? I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
Oh, thank you for the cowbell. We really need more cowbell.
This is part 16 in our series.
Feathers and all, the scriptures are enough.
And we've compiled a resource page for you. If you're just joining the series, you can find everything you need about this series at heidelblog.net/feathers. heidelblog.net/feathers. It has a bibliography, a list of Heidelblog resources, and it's got all the episodes for the series, and it's linked to the show notes for each of the episodes in the series. You can always find everything you need for the Heidelcast at heidelblog.net/Heidelcast, heidelblog.net/Heidelcast. If you just go to any search engine, the one that everyone uses, or others, and just type in HEIDELCAST, you will find us. We are everywhere. Okay, so we have come to 1 Corinthians, and what I want to do for the next few episodes, and I really don't know how many it's going to take. Today, we're just going to do an introduction to 1 Corinthians, because I think one of the problems in this discussion is that people just jump right into 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, and they commit, I think, a fairly serious mistake by doing that. You cannot understand 1 Corinthians 12 if you don't understand 1 Corinthians 1. And I don't think you can understand 1 Corinthians 1 without understanding 2 Corinthians 11 and 2 Corinthians 12. So you really have to understand the Corinthian congregation, and you have to understand the background, behind the congregation and the situation into which the Apostle Paul was writing. So you've got to take a lot of things into consideration when you're trying to figure out what all this means. And the more we know about the background, and the more we know about what's happening within the Corinthian congregation, and fortunately, blessedly, we know a lot actually about what's happening. We know more probably about what's happening within the Corinthian congregation and what's happening around the Corinthian congregation and their background, where they came from, than we know, for example, about Colossians. There's been a lot of work done on Colossae, but it's very, very difficult to figure out exactly what's happening in the Colossian congregation. What's the Colossian heresy? Lots of dispute. I think we know a fair bit more about what's happening in Corinth. Okay, so it's essential to understand, first of all, 1st and 2nd Corinthians together, because they tell the whole story. And I get the sense that where people may sometimes read 1 Corinthians, although I wonder how often it actually gets read, I don't think it's often read together with 2 Corinthians. And yet, as I already suggested, 2 Corinthians 11 and 12 are really, in my view, essential. If you don't understand them, then you're really not going to understand anything else. Okay, so Corinth, where is it? Well, it's, as you might have guessed, connected to Greece. It sits on an isthmus. What's an isthmus? ISTHMUS. Well, the simplest way to put it is it's a land bridge between the Greek mainland and what is called the Peloponnese. Corinth is about 83 kilometers, which I guess just by the driving time, I didn't do the calculations. We were supposed to learn how to do the conversion between metric and...
Oh, stop that double talk. I want to hear the Lone Ranger.
Well, that was one of the problems, Curly. So I was too busy watching the Lone Ranger to learn how to do the conversions between metric and the English system.
Certainly. Are you trying to give me the double talk?
No, I'm not. But anyway, 83 kilometers, and I just guess...
Is everybody done?
Well, it's a guess. That is just judging by the driving time. It's about 56 minutes from what I saw on the Google Maps, and I guess that's about 50 miles, roughly 50 miles west of Athens. So if you're in Athens and you start driving west on the highway, in about an hour, you'll be in Corinth, and you'll go over this sort of land bridge to get to the isthmus. So that's where it is, and it's a notorious city, or it was a notorious city in the ancient world. It was known then. It's known now, not necessarily today. Corinthos is not necessarily, as far as I know, known as a notorious city, but it was known in the ancient world as a notorious city. Some writers talk about temple prostitution in that regard in Corinth, and lots of writers make mention of temple prostitution really based on a comment by Strabo. And that comment, if you look it up, actually doesn't support that contention. So this is just a minor point. I was working on this, getting ready, and I remembered an article written by my dear friend, Steve Baugh, SM Baugh. You can read this article for yourself. We've uploaded it to the Heidelblog, and here's what you do. Just go to heidelblog.net, use the search function, and just type in Rose Bowl Queens, or Rose Bowl, ROSBOWL. That's the part of the title of an article, and it'll pop right up, and you'll see a little quotation there, and that may be all you want to read, but if you want to read more, you can read the actual article for yourself. There's a PDF linked on the site by, as I say, my dear friend Steve Baugh's 1999 journal article on temple prostitution, cult prostitution, religious prostitution in the Roman world. And he challenges a lot of the claims that are made in the secondary literature. The bottom line is that the actual source information for temple prostitution in the Roman world is really very weak. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't sexual immorality in Corinth. If you've ever been to a port city, then you know that's sort of part of the deal. When I moved to San Diego for the first time in 1984, we referred to it as our first tour of duty, though not in the military, just in seminary. I came to the big city of San Diego. It's about 25 miles from Escondido, where we were and where we are now. And well, let's just say it was an eye-opening experience for this boy from Nebraska, because in 1984, the United States was in the midst of a big military buildup under the Reagan administration, and we were, in the middle of coming to the end, really. We didn't know it at the time, but coming to the end of the Cold War, and the American military was about as robust as it had been since World War II, and San Diego was obviously a major military town during World War II, and much of this county was actually put to military use. They used to do mortar practice in Escondido. When I was a student, I'll be quick about this. When I was a student, I came out of my apartment a little bit east of where I am now, and there was two kids, I kid you not, two boys, maybe 9 or 10, something like that, and one of them had a mortar shell. And if my memory serves, it was probably about a foot long. So I don't know. That was a long time ago. And the other kid, I kid you not, it's a true story. This really happened. Kid is sitting there hitting the firing pin on this mortar with a ball peen hammer. that really happened, and I didn't know the state of that mortar, and whether it would go off or not, and but I knew enough to take the ball peen hammer from the kid and the mortar, much to his displeasure, and I called the police department, and I don't know why, but they sent a sheriff's deputy over. And he showed up, and here I am standing there holding this shell, unexploded. And he says, what do you want me to do with it? I said, I don't know. You're the one with the uniform and the car. I just live here. So anyway, he took it away. No idea what he did with it. Well, as it turns out, there were lots of those over there because San Diego was full of that. Military operations. They were driving tanks and firing mortars all over the county, doing flying planes, building planes. Anyway, so when I got here in 84, it was just full of military people. And if you go down by the ocean, you go down by the what they call here the PCH, Pacific Coast Highway. I had to stop and think what it stands for, the Pacific Coast Highway or the harbor. There were lots of interesting shops that we didn't have in my sort of Mayberry-esque hometown of Lincoln, Nebraska. They had, this is a family show, so I'm struggling to think of how to put this delicately, but you grown-ups can understand, the kinds of businesses. Well, one of the things that I'd never seen before were tattoo parlors, and those were among the sort of least shocking of the businesses that were available to American military personnel in 1984. Well, so that gives you a sense of what it was like in Corinth. It was a prosperous city. It's a port city. It's a cosmopolitan city, which means lots of people from lots of different places, lots of different languages being spoken. It was the home to the Isthmian Games every 2 years, kind of a Greek Olympics. And it was a city that had a Greek past, but as Paul wrote to them, they'd been conquered by the Romans in 146 BC, and about 100 years later, Julius Caesar rebuilt Corinth as a Roman colony.
The best podcast, the Hydrocast.
When Paul got there, and when he wrote 1 Corinthians, the congregation itself was mostly composed of Gentiles, and probably not entirely, but mostly, who were converts from paganism. And these were new Christians, new converts who needed a lot of instruction. And we could talk a lot about the paganism or the various kinds of paganisms that were prominent in Corinth, but the essence of pagan religion, really all of it, but particularly, I suppose, the paganism of the Greco-Roman world, is power and control. Power and control. It's really a kind of pagan Methodism. It's all about techniques to get the gods to do what you want them to do. That's number one. And two, to avoid being harmed by the gods, because there's a lot of, it's superstition is what it is, and a lot of fear of the unknown, these unknown, malevolent local deities and national deities. And, the pagan gods are vindictive. They're really not very nice. You get a sense of it just by reading classical mythology. It's a cosmic soap opera. And you think, I don't want to read classical mythology. That's dull. Well, let me ask you a question. Do you ever watch any of the Marvel or DC movies or read the Marvel or DC comic books? If you watch those movies or you read the comic books on which they're based, you are reading classical mythology, because all those stories are more or less, some of them taken sort of straight out of classical mythology, but most of them are modeled on the classical myths. So all the drama that you get in the comic books or the comic book movies, you get the same kind of drama and the same kind of weirdness and vindictiveness, and you sometimes see heroic actions and characters and so forth. That's classical paganism. And again, we could go farther into detail here. We can get lost in the weeds, but the essence of pagan religion is finding a way to get the gods to do what you want them to do. And then the flip side of that, sort of the dark side, is to find a way to keep the gods from doing bad things to you, because they have a tendency to do that. They're sort of ill-tempered and malevolent. All right, what about Paul in Corinth? Well, about AD 50, in 51, Paul visited Corinth on his second missionary journey. You can read about that in Acts 18, the first part of the chapter, and he stayed there, according to Acts 18:11, for about 18 months. And then he left, and he went to Ephesus. And he was in Ephesus for quite a while, and it was from Ephesus in AD 55 that he wrote 1 Corinthians, which was part of a stream of correspondence between Paul and the congregation. Now, in the providence of God, we don't have all of this correspondence. So scholars argue about whether we have 1st and 3rd or 2nd and 4th. And I don't see any way of sorting that out. But what you need to know, what I need to know, is that there's a stream of correspondence going back and forth. And we know that from the first part of 1 Corinthians, where Paul mentions that he had received something from Chloe or Chloe's people, a family within the congregation, who had written to Paul to communicate concerns about and news about what's happening in the Corinthian congregation. So here I'm going to rearrange a little bit a list of issues that Kim Riddlebarger highlights in his, I think, very helpful commentary in the Lectio Continua series published by Reformation Heritage Books. It was just recently republished, I think, second edition in 2024, first edition in 2012. And these are lettered, so I'd like to count them for you, but they're lettered. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 issues, if I counted right, A through K, if that gets me to 11. So factions, that's always the sign of significant problems in a congregation when it's divided into factions. I'm of this one, and another group says I'm of that one, and so forth. We'll come back and look at that. But that's an indicator that what is at stake here is not mutual submission to Christ, but an attempt by certain people to exercise influence and control in the congregation. Whenever you have a group of people gathered together, there's always going to be a temptation to reduce the relationship to one of power and control. And we see that in both 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Secondly, there's lots of confusion about whether or how believers ought to separate from unbelievers. And this is what you get when you have new converts, people just emerging from paganism, just learning about Christianity, just embracing Christ, just putting their trust in Christ, and just being initiated into the visible covenant community by instruction and baptism, maybe just now being admitted to the table. And these people are very new converts. So they're still thinking through a lot of issues and sometimes not very successfully figuring out some of these very difficult issues. And of course, these are, as I indicate, very difficult issues. Here we are in a post-Christian society, and we do experience some of this, but they are in a pre-Christian society. There are very few Christians in the Greco-Roman world in AD 55. For the most part, nobody knows who the Christians are, or what they are, or why they are, or what they believe, how they fit in the broader scheme of things, how they relate to the dominant culture and the dominant religion and the state and all that. And the Christians themselves are trying to figure that stuff out as well. And so it's a very serious question. Well, now that we're not pagans anymore, how do we relate to all the pagans who are around us? For example, one of the major issues that comes up that gets dealt with in the epistle is, well, what about meals? All the food in the Greco-Roman world was dedicated by the butchers to the gods. And sometimes if they were having a meal, somebody would say this meal is dedicated to the gods, which is a problem for Christians. As you may know, we've talked about it on the Heidelcast. I've talked about it in this series a little bit. So, then, well, what do you do? Well, as long as they don't, Paul says, as long as they don't say this is dedicated to the gods, you can eat if it's not a matter of conscience for you, if it's not going to lead you to go back into paganism, or if it's not going to lead your brother to go back into paganism, then it's fine. Those gods don't exist. You can eat that food. But the minute they say this is a religious meal, not just a mere ordinary secular meal, a common meal, the minute they make it a religious meal, then you have to say, well, I'm sorry, I can't participate because I'm a Christian and I'm a worshiper of Christ, and he's instituted a meal, and that is our sacred meal in which we participate. There is real sexual immorality in the congregations, one of the issues. Actually, I think I doubled up this, but you've got homosexuality, you've got incest, and you've got people visiting prostitutes, which gets us back to life in a port city in AD 55, or in San Diego, California in the 1980s and 90s. Well, even today, I imagine too, but it was very visible in downtown San Diego in early mid-1980s. Hostility toward the apostles was an issue, and that is actually an indicator of an underlying issue that we're going to get to. Lawsuits between believers. Now think of this. Nobody in Corinth knows who or what Christians are. And so some Christians got crosswise with each other. Some business dealing went bad or something. Who knows what happened exactly? But believers were taking other believers within the Corinthian congregation to the Roman secular civil courts in order to sort out their problems. So that the first time some pagans ever heard about Christianity was when two Christ professors were standing before this pagan judge complaining about how the other one had mistreated one of his brothers in the congregation.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
They were struggling with the problem of marriage and divorce. So you have people who are converted and married to unbelievers. What do we do now? Do we remain married, or should we divorce this person since now this person's a pagan, I'm a Christian? Can I be joined to this person sexually in marriage, even though they're a pagan, and now I belong to Christ and I'm joined to Christ? What do I do? And Paul says, well, as long as they're willing to remain married, then you remain married. But if they leave, if they abandon you, they divorce you, then you are free, is basically what he says. And he says other things as well, and we won't get into all of that, but just to give you a sense of the kinds of issues that they're dealing with. I mentioned food offered to idols and idolatry generally. So people are coming out of idolatry and coming out of pagan religions where they actually venerated little handmade gods. And as crazy as that might seem, of course, if you travel the globe or go into really any major American city, you'll see people who venerate handmade gods. And it's not as maybe as remote as it might have been at one time. And it certainly wasn't remote to the Corinthian experience in the middle of the 2nd century. So you won't be surprised when I tell you that one of the major issues for the Corinthians was how to worship. They didn't immediately grasp the rule of worship, that we do in worship only what God has commanded. They didn't get that. They didn't know how to love one another, which is an even deeper underlying issue. And they didn't know how to love one another in worship, how to treat one another with love and respect and with patience and mutual forbearing in worship. They didn't know how to conduct worship in an orderly way. They didn't know how to observe the Lord's Supper in an orderly way. They even turned, and we're going to get to this, they even turned the Lord's Supper into a kind of power religion contest where people used the Lord's Supper, strangely, perversely, as a way to show, who was superior to whom. You can't imagine that happening in a, Christian congregation in 2024. So that never happens anymore. They were struggling with the very question of the bodily resurrection. Coming out of Greco-Roman religion, there was a strong impulse to sort of do away with the body. We want to get rid of the body. Plato called the body the prison house of the soul. And so a number of the members of the Corinthian congregation struggled with the idea that, Jesus' physical body had been raised and that their physical bodies had been raised because they didn't know how to think about the body as part of the human person and part of the image of God. And of course, I've already touched on lovelessness. So Paul devotes an entire chapter to the nature of love. And one of the things I'm going to do in this series that often doesn't get done in the discussion of the gifts and continuationism is to discuss 1 Corinthians chapter 13, because I think it's essential to Paul's argument. One of the great problems of all forms of continuationism is that it divides the body into two kinds of people, haves and have-nots, right? And there is a certain, I think, lovelessness in that, because there are not two kinds of Christians. There's only one kind of Christian, right? Those who are united to Christ. If you are united to Christ, you are united to Christ. There are not those who are united to Christ and then have had the blessing, and those who are united to Christ who haven't had the blessing. There's no such thing. That is a fabrication. It's never happened, it isn't happening, and it never will happen. There's only one kind of Christian. That person for whom Christ came, Christ obeyed, Christ died, Christ was raised, Christ is interceding, and Christ will redeem utterly at the last day and take to himself. That's it. There are not two classes of Christians. There are different kinds of gifts, a diversity of distribution, the Apostle Paul says, but only one kind of Christian. And the key to learning how to relate to each other over this matter is love. We'll come back to that. But and then finally, spiritual gifts in chapters 12 and 14. And of course, if my understanding of the whole Corinthian problem is correct, then this really becomes, again, the whole discussion is symptomatic, as you sort of read between the lines, of these underlying problems. And so when Paul discusses spiritual gifts, he's actually working on these spiritual problems that plagued the Corinthians. And I think probably plague the church in the post-apostolic world as well.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
One of the, and perhaps the major problem underlying all of the other problems in the Corinthian congregation. And by the way, these were so profound, these problems in the Corinthian congregation, that we read an epistle written by, in my view, almost certainly a layman, maybe a ruling elder, who is known as Clement. We really don't know who wrote First Clement, but that's how it's known, and probably around AD 100. Some people date it, much earlier than that. I doubt that, just from the context and from the external history, but probably not much later than AD 100. And then there is a second document, not an epistle, a sermon, almost, in my view, certainly from Alexandria. Scholars dispute that, but it seems most likely. The Alexandria in the 2nd century is the Berkeley or the Madison or the Austin, or pick another, a Boulder, right? So another sort of wacky college town. That's what that's what Alexandria was. So with my students, I often refer to Berkeley because we have students from Cal, and they sort of get that. The Cal campuses tend to be divided between the science, STEM, and the arts. And typically all the weirdness, especially in Berkeley, is associated with the arts part of the campus. So I don't know how it is now, but it wasn't very long ago that one could read in the paper about the naked man who would ride his bicycle through Berkeley. So it's so interesting. I remember telling that to a student who was a STEM student at Cal Berkeley, and he's a green graduate. He's a student of ours. And I was mentioning that. He was looking at me like, what are you talking about? So the STEM guys or the STEM students tended to be a little isolated from some. Because they were busy studying, actually, instead of smoking dope and doing the weird stuff that they do over on the arts side of the campus. At any rate, so that's Alexandria in the 2nd century, kind of a cauldron of weirdness, and that's where 2nd Clement probably comes from, and that's a sermon is where all that was heading, and it's aimed at the Corinthians. And if you sort of read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then you read 1st Clement, which is aimed at the Corinthians, then you read 2nd Clement, which is another 50 years later, you get a picture of the Corinthian congregation that's 100 years long, a century long, where 50 years later, in 1st Clement, still dealing with a lot of the same problems. Now, he's very, in my view, long-winded and sort of indirect. But if you read it carefully, and I've read 1st Clement many, many times, you see that he's addressing many of the very same problems 50 years later after the Apostle Paul. And then 2nd Clement dealing with some of the very same problems another 50 years later. So a century after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, 2nd Clement is still addressing, by way of a sermon, as far as I know, the earliest recorded Christian sermon. In other words, we have not a transcript exactly, but a kind of a written record of this sermon. Other than, if you think of Hebrews as a sermon, and I do, then that would be earlier. But in terms of post-canonical sermons, 2nd Clement is quite early. So what does that mean? It means there's a very deep-rooted problems in Corinth, and it means that an apostle, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and he probably wrote a total of 4 letters to the Corinthians, was not able to, if I can put it this way, fix the Corinthian congregation. And what does that mean? Well, there are a lot of sort of triumphalist types with an over-realized eschatology who have, unrealistic and overly optimistic ideas about what can be accomplished in this life. And if the Apostle Paul, who had been taken up to the third heaven, because it's pretty clear to most people that he is the man, whom Paul describes, who was taken up to the third heaven, which would be, sort of an affirmation of his prophetic apostolic credentials, who had raised people from the dead, who had thrown off a viper, who had survived being stoned and shipwrecked, and all those things. If he, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, repeatedly could not fix the Corinthian congregation, such that the very same problems are still present 100 years later, then, maybe we need to adjust our expectations about what happens in this life oftentimes. Anyway, this is really, in a way, about eschatology. Right? We live in a fallen world. We live in the in-between time between the ascension of Christ and the return of Christ. And we make, by the grace of God, we make some progress in sanctification. But sometimes some congregations are just very, very hard. And this is one of those. Now, all that to say that you could say a symptom or a cause, I guess I don't really care, but the major, I think, underlying problem here in the Corinthian congregation emerges in 2 Corinthians, and they are the self-described, usually called super apostles in English, but given the adjective that Paul uses, huperleion, we could call them hyper apostles might be more accurate. So these are super apostles. I'm going to call them hyper apostles to sort of honor the adjective that Paul uses. And you see it in 2 Corinthians. I'm going to read a little bit around the verse. So 2 Corinthians 11, 3 through 8. But I am afraid, this is Paul, and this is the English Standard Version, I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, does that sound familiar? Doesn't that sound a little bit like Galatians? Anyway, you put up with it readily enough. Now, that seems to indicate that kind of thing had happened. And in other words, it's not a hypothetical, that it's already going on, so that the gospel message is in question in the Corinthian congregation. And Paul goes on to say, indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these, and I'm going to modify the ESV here, these hyper apostles, even if I am unskilled in speaking. We should probably put that in quotation marks. All right, he's poking at them. Why is he saying unskilled in speaking? Because that is what the hyper apostles were saying about him. You know, that Paul, he's not very polished. You know, there are a lot of great orators in Corinth, and Paul's certainly no match for these great orators who could hold a group spellbound for an hour or 2 hours or more. And Paul, he stumbles, you know. That's the kind of thing they were saying. And Paul says, I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way, we have made this plain to you in all things. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. Well, of course, Paul had said to the Corinthians that they were not mature enough to be able to support his ministry financially. It was not good for them spiritually for them to be able to support him financially.
The Heidelcast.
They weren't ready, and so he didn't let them. He supported himself by selling tents in the marketplace. And then look at 2 Corinthians 12, 5 through 13. Again, from the English Standard Version. I may modify it a little bit, but it'll work. On behalf of this man, talking about himself, I will boast. This is the one who'd been to the third heaven. But on my own behalf, I will not boast except of my weaknesses. Now, again, what are the hyper-apostles saying? They're powerful. They have the ability to control God, to get what they want. They're polished. Their guys are polished. They have a different gospel, I suspect. Not a gospel of free salvation through grace alone or by grace alone, through faith alone in Christ alone, but another kind of a gospel to which we contribute. At any rate, and Paul goes on, though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So, to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, and these are revelations that Paul had been given, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. We don't know what the thorn is. Lots of people speculate, and we just don't know. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. Let me interrupt here. So you can get a sense by reverse reading of the kinds of things that the hyper-apostles were saying. We are respected. We understand the culture. The culture understands us. We are prosperous. We are strong. We are articulate, you see. All these things that the Corinthians valued. And what does Paul offer? Well, he offers weakness. Now, these are two different theologies. One is, these hyper-apostles are what Luther would call theologians of glory, of conquest, and this worldly power, and, the kind of, rhetoric and reason that this world values. And what is Paul offering? Well, a crucified Savior. Again, think of this, Corinth was rebuilt as a Roman colony. And so these are Greek-speaking, culturally Romans. Not to say there's no Greek influence. There's plenty of Greek influence. But how was crucifixion regarded among the Romans? Well, not well. Right? It was disgusting, and the people who were crucified were disgusting. And so to say that you were following a crucified man is maybe the most scandalous thing that you could say in the Greco-Roman world, right? Greek-speaking Roman world. And that's what Paul is offering. We'll come back to that. We continue. Paul says, "For when I am weak, then I am strong. I have been a fool. You forced me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I was not at all inferior to these," and I'm going to modify the ESV here, "hyper-apostles, even though I am nothing. The signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works." By the way, this is really, really important. Why did Paul perform signs and wonders and mighty works? To authenticate his apostolic office. Nothing about self-expression, nothing about self-realization, nothing about glorification of self, but to authenticate his apostolic office. For in what were you less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you? Forgive me this wrong. And you can see Paul's being a little sarcastic even here. So this is the fundamental issue in Corinth. This is what you have to understand in order to understand the whole question, the whole discourse about gifts and tongues and prophecy and healing, right? He's writing to a congregation that's still getting over the pagan theology of power and glory. This pagan religion is about power. And the Corinthians were tempted by what Mike Horton has very properly characterized as power religion. And the hyper-apostles were, as I indicated, what Luther called theologians of glory. That's what they were selling. Paul, by contrast, was a theologian of the cross. And what he was selling, as it were, was Christ crucified. And what the Corinthians and what the pagans saw, at least some of the Corinthians, certainly the hyper-apostle saw, as weakness. Paul says, "I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree and that there be no divisions among you." Why are there divisions? Because the hyper-apostles had divided the congregation, right? But that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. This is just like, Philippians 2, isn't it? Paul goes on, "For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you, my brothers." Why is there quarreling? The hyper-apostles. What I mean is each one of you says, "I follow Paul," or "I follow Apollos," or "I follow Cephas," that's Peter, or "I follow Christ," which is always the most spiritual thing to say. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. I did baptize also the household, the oikos, of Stephanas, by the way. So that would get us into another issue, but just pay attention to the fact that he baptized a household, not a building, but a family, covenantal family unit. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. By the way, I understand Paul entirely. I know I have baptized a number of people. One time, some years ago, there was a church plant. There was a whole bunch of people that hadn't been baptized. I don't remember how many people I baptized, but it was, I don't know, something like 10. And if you asked me, I couldn't tell you who they were. It was a long time ago. So I understand how that could be. Ask Chad Vegas. I don't know how many people he has baptized, both children and adult converts over the last 6 months, 8 months, a year. I know it's well over 50. So anyway, he probably could tell you who they are, but I could not tell you all the people I've baptized. For Christ, he says, did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. And not with words of eloquent wisdom. Of course, that's the pitch of the hyper-apostles, right? They were calling for eloquent wisdom in a sort of Greco-Roman way, lest, Paul says, now listen to this, the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. Wow. 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 17, modified from the ESV. Let's listen to Paul some more, because this, I think, is so powerful. And if you let this sink in, I think you'll understand more about what he's doing relative to the gifts. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. What's the word? It's the word of the cross, right? The most disreputable way of dying that you could possibly imagine in the Roman Empire. And that's how he characterizes the Christian gospel, as the word of the cross. We follow a man who was crucified. That's about death, and that's about humiliation. It's the antithesis of everything the hyper-apostles were selling. For it is written, Paul says, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, that's the hyper-apostles, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Those are the ones that the hyper-apostles thought were so cool. Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the foolishness of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So that's revised from 1 Corinthians 1, 18 through 25 in the English Standard Version. I just modified the ESV a little bit along the way. So go back and read 1 and 2 Corinthians together and see if that dynamic, right, the theologian of the cross, Paul, versus the theologians of glory, the hyper-apostles, see if that dynamic doesn't explain a lot of what you see in 1 and 2 Corinthians. The Corinthians wanted social respectability, a power religion, a religion that delivered this worldly goods of various sorts. I don't mean just money, although I think that's part of it, but social respectability, I think. And how often has that driven what the church does, what it does? The desire for social respectability. And what is Paul calling the Corinthians to sacrifice? He's calling them to sacrifice social respectability, to follow a crucified man in AD 55 in a cosmopolitan Greco-Roman city, a Roman colony, right? To follow a crucified man who's been raised from the dead, who's ascended and seated at the right hand, but who's invisible and whom we won't see bodily until he returns again. That is not a path to social respectability in Corinth. And the Corinthian congregation, of course, didn't get the message. As I said, we know because we can look at the, correspondence and sermons and so forth coming 50 years later and then 100 years later after 1 Corinthians. So it's against that background and in light of that theology of the hyper-apostles, the theology of glory, of power and dominion, and, by the way, self-expression, being sold by the hyper-apostles, that we have to understand Paul's teaching about the gifts. So whatever we conclude about the nature of the gifts in 1 Corinthians, we also have to remember that we're looking, and this I think is so easy to forget, we're looking at the apostolic church. So remember all the things that we've seen to this point, right? That the things that we've learned thus far from the rest of Scripture and from Acts apply here. The gospel is going to the ends of the earth. Signs and wonders in the new covenant, speaking and hearing in foreign languages supernaturally. That's what tongues mean. Glossa, right? Glossa and glossae, those are natural languages being spoken supernaturally and being heard supernaturally. Prophecy, which tends to mean in the New Testament, maybe not in every case, but tends to mean a direct revelation from the Lord through a person, right? In the absence, and this is very important again that people tend to ignore, in the absence of a complete New Testament canon. So AD 55, the canon won't be completed until AD 93. The Gospel of John probably hasn't been written. 1 John, 2 John doesn't exist. 1 Peter doesn't exist. 2 Peter, Hebrews probably doesn't exist. By 55, as far as I know, the synoptic Gospels all exist, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So they have that. But a number of the epistles don't yet exist. Galatians, I think, exists. James exists, but not everybody has access. So that's the other thing you have to remember. So, today, if we want to see the New Testament, it's so very, very easy. I don't know how many apps I have on my phone, Bible apps. I tend to use Olive Tree. Generally, it's my default, or Logos. Those are the two things I use, but there's an ESV app, and there are lots of other Bible apps. And I have a number of them on my phone. I have them on my tablets. I have them on my computers. And of course, then there's just the old-fashioned hard copy. I have shelves of, hard copies of the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew and Aramaic, and the Greek New Testament. I have numerous copies of the Greek New Testament in different editions. So, we're just blessed, in a sense, beyond belief with an amazing number of riches in terms of access to the Bible. That just did not exist for most people most of the time in the first century. So most scholars would think, or tend to think, that, a congregation only had fragments of the New Testament. My friend Steve Boss suggests that some of those congregations may have had more than we think, but I don't think anybody knows for sure. And typically we think that they had only parts. They had a copy of the epistle that was sent to them. They may have had a copy of another epistle, but obviously if it doesn't exist in AD 55, nobody has the entire New Testament. So that's very important that you remember that. You can't just anachronistically imagine that they have what we have, because they just didn't have it. So prophecy then, and healing, and the supernatural gifts, they were part of the establishment of the New Covenant Church and its expansion into the Gentile world. They were not meant to continue in perpetuity any more than the Noahic flood, parting of the Red Sea, the ascension of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, and the resurrections that we saw in the New Testament associated with Jesus' death, or when the apostles raised people from the dead, or a member of the apostolic company being transported by the Holy Spirit. None of those things were intended to be happening in perpetuity. They are part of, associated with the establishment of the New Covenant Church. So the tragedy of the modern focus on the gifts is that we've almost missed Paul's big point completely. Now listen to what Paul says. But earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you still a more excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic power, this is from the ESV, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. Right? How often do you hear this language in connection with the controversy over gifts and continuationism and all the claims of the sort of, in light of what we know from the ancient history of the church, we could call them the Neo-Montanists, right? Because those were the folks in the 2nd century who most clearly claimed to be continuing the apostolic phenomena, and who identified what they were experiencing and what they claimed to be able to do with the apostles, even though the rest of the church doubted that and rejected their claim, and even disciplined them, denounced them as heretics. Right? Remember that the earliest synods in the church were met to deal with the Montanist claims. And so we shouldn't accept as normative neo-Montanism. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I don't mean to be speaking in tongues, but I have explained all of this. So go back and listen to the beginning of the series. If you're just joining the series, go to heidelblog.net/feathers. Or subscribe to the Heidelcast, and then you go back and you can see the series for yourself. But go to heidelblog.net/feathers. You can see the whole series, and you could see lots of other articles, and it gives some context. So if the word Montanist doesn't mean anything to you, go back and listen to the earlier episodes in the series, and then it will mean something to you. But notice what Paul says. And by the way, people say, angels, there it is, tongues of men and angels. No, friends, that's hyperbole. He's not saying that you can actually speak with the tongues of angels, right? So some of the discussion about gifts in our age is simply born of, frankly, very serious misunderstanding of the text. People are reading a text without the ability to tell when Paul's using a figure of speech. It's just like reading Genesis 6, and when God is said to repent, you're not supposed to think, oh, I guess that means God can change his mind. No, you're supposed to think, oh, that's a figure of speech. How many problems could we avoid if people could just recognize basic figures of speech? Anyway, that's what's going on here. But don't miss the point. If I have all of these powers that existed in the apostolic church, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. That's where Paul gets to. That's what he thinks is the most important gift, is love, right? If you want to be a continuationist, the thing that ought to continue out of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, out of the apostolic period, is love. The continuationist movement is and has always been, whether among the Montanists or the Anabaptists or the Old Pentecostals or the Neo-Pentecostals or the Charismatics, it has always been, and I know this is a hard word to hear, but it's always been a form of power religion. It's a quest for power and control. And to the degree it is a quest for power and control, when they're offering techniques where you can get God to do what you want, it has more to do with the paganism from which the Corinthians were being called than it has to do with the theology of the cross that Paul actually taught in 1 Corinthians. And we have taken the theology of the hyper-apostles, and we have, some anyway, have tried to make it normative for the post-apostolic church. And they've divided the church into those who have the gifts and those who don't, which is exactly the kind of factionalism that existed in the Corinthian church, which is amazing. And you can see the symptoms of the sickness in the Corinthian congregation. As I say, factions, right? I fed you with milk, Scripture says, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you're not ready, for you are still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not merely being human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. By the way, how did they come to faith? The Lord assigned. The Lord brought them to faith. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. That's 1 Corinthians 3:3-7. Foolishness is another symptom. Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks he is wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is folly with God. For it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. Again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. So let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, that's Peter, or the world, or life or death, or the present or the future. All are yours, and you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. 1 Corinthians 3:18-23, again from the English Standard Version. Glory is another symptom. Again, Paul says, already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Without us, you've become kings. He's poking them. And would that you did reign, so that we might share the rule with you. For I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we in disrepute. To the present hour we hunger and thirst. We are poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless, and we labor, working with our own hands. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We have become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. It's Paul in 1 Corinthians 4:18 through 23. Again, from the English Standard Version. Do you see how Paul contrasts his theology of the cross with the theology of glory and power and control and dominion of the hyper-apostles and apparently a lot of the Corinthian congregation? Out of the hyper-apostle theology, their theology of glory, came gross sexual immorality. I won't dwell on this. I know it's a family podcast, but it's in the Bible. Incest of some kind. Homosexuality. Paul has to get into that in, some fairly graphic detail, actually. The English translations sort of downplay what Paul says, but he's actually very specific there in 1 Corinthians 6 about the different relationships, we'll say. And if you want to read more about that, you can. I've described that and to discuss that some on the Heidel blog at heidelblog.net. You just search for those terms. It'll turn up, and there's a resource page on the resource pages at heidelblog.net/resources. You can find that there. And then prostitution, right? Members of the congregation joining themselves to prostitutes. How amazing is that? And Paul has to explain to them, no, you're united to Christ. You can't be united to a prostitute.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.
Then revenge is another symptom. We see that emerging in lawsuits between believers, which we've already talked about that. These are all evidences of serious spiritual immaturity. And so we have to understand Paul's teaching about the gifts against the background of all of those things as we next time come to Paul's teaching about the gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 12.
The story you have just heard was true. Only the names were changed to protect the innocent.
That's it for this episode of the Heidelcast. Join us next time as we continue our series.
Sinners and all, the scriptures are enough.
Don't miss an episode. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app. Email heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Call or text the Heidel phone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563. Or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Remember, the Heidelcast may be cheap, but it isn't free. When the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks.
Copyright 2024. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
Without the creed, what are we? What do we stand for?
All right, that's it. Let's roll. Hey.
Let's be careful.
Good night, Chet. And from Washington, thank you, and good night for all of us at NBC News.
Nothing is over until we decide it is.
Silence! I kill you!
I'm out of here!
We're a little late. Good night, folks.
Well, gracious, say good night.
Good night.
And good night, Mrs. Calabash. We're
Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis has left the building.
This concludes our broadcasting activities for today.
Tune in tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel.
Just as way that machine, Sherman and I were quickly on our way.
Gosh, thanks, Lynn Anderson, Rose Garden. Hi, I'm just doing really funky things. Shadow Stevens on your radio set, 5:56. Here's George Harrison.
Don't need to love it.
KRLA, Pasadena, entertaining Southern California.
KRLA.
6 o'clock on the Shadow Stevens radio show. Doing some good music for your hair tonight. Here's Led Zeppelin. Oh, certainly is a black leather look cape and cellophane wings with the Shadow. 6:04 at KRLA. Super music. From 1966 to Birds. For the Bellflower Lowriders on KRLA. Got so much music, your brains will fall out. Listen, 6:07 on The Shadow. I'm not my brother's keeper. I'm not my brother's keeper. That's Flaming Ember. It's 6:10 non-stoppable music from KRLA on The Shadow. Here's Bob Summers.
The Shadow.
All right, for all the good heads on Whittier Boulevard, doing some low riding and some creeping on Monday night, 6:13 at KRLA. Here's that Black Magic Woman. Need clean fun with Shadow Stevens. It's 6:15 at KRLA with non-stopping hit music from the Carpenters. I'd like to smooth you out some with the Carpenters now and then from their Close to You album. That's Mr. Gooder at KRLA at 6:18 with The Shadow.
There was a crooked man.
See, there was a crooked man now showing exclusively at Pacific's Pix Theater in Hollywood. Fair, windy, near freezing tonight. Low tonight will be 35 degrees, and the high tomorrow is 60 degrees with no smog. It's 50 degrees. 50 degrees now downtown. In the valley, it's 45. Orange County, 48 degrees.
KRLA presents the Carpenters in concert.
6:23 on the Shadow Stevens radio show. Once again, computerized psychedelics. Okay. Steppenwolf and the Magic Carpet Riders see a super concert with B.B. King from KRLA, the Anaheim Convention Center, January 24th, which is a Sunday. Here, keep that in mind. 6:26 on the Shadow Stevens show. Here's Diana Ross.
KRLA, Pasadena, entertaining Southern California.
KRLA.
6:30 on the Shadow.
This is KRLA News. President Nixon is at this moment conversing with 4 news media representatives at the White House. LA weather, fair and cold tonight, the low 35. Clear again tomorrow with no smog and a high of 60. This is Paul Oscar Anderson.
I'm stopping now.
The best podcast